You. Eric's just mentioned your goodie bags. In your goodie bags, there are two publications from the Yorkshire Dialect Society. One is the Summer Bulletin. The other is the Transactions of the Yorkshire Dialect Society. I mentioned that particularly to explain this title of mine, Doing Dialects Today, Bringing Grandad Up to Date. There's a celebratory element, and that's the dominant thing about this gathering, isn't it? Celebrating local speech, and local speech of our forebears as well as our own. And that really is the stuff of the Summer Bulletin, where people particularly get a chance to write in the dialect, as well as write about the dialect and how they feel about it and so on. But a lot of it is, of course, compositions in the dialect. The Transactions of the Yorkshire Dialect Society goes back to the days of our founder, Joseph Wright, in the late 1890s, when learned gentlemen studied the dialect, and I'll be talking a little bit about that in a minute, and wrote about it in somewhat learned terms. And we carry on that tradition in the Transactions of the Yorkshire Dialect Society. If you like, the Summer Bulletin celebrates the dialect, and the Transactions analyse the dialects. It's the Transactions of the Yorkshire Dialect Society, but it's not just about Yorkshire dialect. Any dialect can be the stuff of Transactions, although of course a lot of it's about Yorkshire. And because most of what we're going to be getting today is on the celebration side, I thought what I'd do is concentrate particularly on the formal study of dialect, not in any heavy way, because it doesn't have to be heavy, but the formal analysis of the dialects. And Rod last night said that the membership of the Yorkshire Dialect Society is somewhat in decline. And that shouldn't actually depress people at all, because society changes and people's needs and wishes about what they want to join changes. But dialectology, it has to be an ology, doesn't it? Dialectology is very, very, very vibrant. There are young people in universities today and doing their A-levels as well. I had an email only a couple of days ago, somewhat clueless I have to say, from a student at Leeds Grammar School who I had to ask for more information because he didn't know what he was asking. But he is doing some study at school on dialect, and we probably know people who are doing study. Lots and lots of courses on what's usually called now language variation and change. Change, important word. In 2008 at Leeds, we hosted the 13th of a whole series of triennial big international bashes on dialectology, and we had there over 200 delegates from 20 countries coming for a week to talk about the study of dialect. And that is next year. It's going to be in Japan. It's a big international thing, this study of what we are interested in ourselves. So bringing Grandad up to date isn't a case of, telling Grandad or Grandma to suck eggs. It's about, there's that side of things, yes, the traditional side, but there's also a load of stuff going on now which has a lot of relevance to the study of language more generally. Let's concentrate just briefly on this word dialect. I want to read out a definition from the 1950s by a linguist called Abercrombie, who in his day was very highly regarded, did some great stuff. And he talks about dialect like this: I've used the word dialect for any form of English which differs from standard English in grammar, syntax, vocabulary and pronunciation. There are some nods, right? Not surprisingly, because that is generally, if you went out on the street and asked people what dialect is, that's what they'd say. Well, it's different from the standard and so on. Let's focus down on that just a little bit. What dialects have? Dialects have a distinct grammar. They have typical words, what's sometimes called word geography. You know, you can place words in different places. And also pronunciation. And in fact, that lot out there, if we said dialect, they'd immediately start talking about the funny noises people make. That'd be the first thing before they even got on to words. And they might think about a little bit of grammar as well. But grammar, words, and pronunciation. What dialect isn't is as important as what dialect is. I'd assert that dialect is not only the non-standard. The standard language, what I call the standard dialect, is a dialect like any other. By historical accident, at the moment, that is the one that we write our newspapers in, that we elevate in certain ways, and that some people have come to think of as better than the other dialects, but it's not. It's just a version of the language, and it is no better. So that's the next thing. A dialect is not below the standard. It's not sub-standard. It's non-standard if it's not the standard dialect, but it is not sub-standard. And very often the forms that we use are historically much more authenticated in the non-standard dialects than the forms that we use in the standard as well. It's not variation according to style either. You know, I'm knackered, right? Expletive deleted, is not dialect. It's a style. It's a very informal, colloquial style, but it's standard. Swearing is standard. The boys at Eton swear, probably swear a lot more and a lot worse than a lot of us do, and they are not lapsing out of the standard at all. So we're not talking style, whereas I be very tired, right? Even I be very tired, sounds odd, of course, in RP, in received pronunciation, but I be very tired is non-standard. It's got a non-standard grammar about it. We're all agreed there on that. And it's not only geographical or regional variation. And I'll get onto that a little bit later. So that's what dialect is not. It's not non-standard, it's not substandard, it's not just stylistic, and it's not only geographical or regional. So a working definition of dialect, moving on from Abercrombie, should have reference to the areas of language, you know, of pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary. It should avoid simple geographical limitations. It should make clear a non-prescriptive stance. We're not saying this is worse than something else. And it should be inclusive of all varieties, standard and non-standard. So I come straight away to a definition which I think is an improvement on Abercrombie's, from a chap called Raven McDavid, an American. Don't the Americans have fabulous Christian names? Raven. Wouldn't you like to be called Raven, gentlemen? Okay, it's fabulous. Raven McDavid, now dead, but a very, very, very famous American dialectologist. And this is what McDavid wrote back in, I suppose, the 1970s, 80s. A dialect, simply defined as a variety of the language, generally mutually intelligible with other varieties of that language. It says generally, we can lose track, can't we, with someone. Generally mutually intelligible, but set off from them by a unique complex of features of pronunciation, grammar and vocabulary. Dialect thus used is not a derogatory term, but a descriptive one. And I hope we can all sort of fall in line with Raven on that. Raven McDavid, what a name. We'll move on. Having established where I am, you don't have to agree with me, and you can come and, you know, get me up against the wall and complain later if you want. But that's where I stand on what dialect is.